call, and I'll be there, yeah, yeah, yeah. You've got a friend. If the sky above you should turn dark and full of clouds, and that old north wind should begin to blow, keep your head together and call my name out loud now. Soon I'll be knocking upon your door. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running. Oh yes, I will see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, yeah. All you got to do is call, and I'll be there, yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, ain't it good to know that you've got a friend? People can be so cold, they'll hurt you and desert you. Well, they'll take your soul if you let them. Oh yeah, but don't you let them. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running to see you again. Oh baby, don't you know about winter, spring, summer, or fall? Hey now, all you've got to do is call. Lord, I'll be there, yes I will. No, you've got a friend. You've got a friend, yeah. Ain't it good to know you've got a friend? Ain't it good to know you've got a friend? Oh yeah, yeah, you've got a friend. Do me wrong, but do me right. Tell me lies, but hold me tight. Save your goodbyes for the morning light, but don't let me be lonely tonight. Say goodbye and say hello. It's sure enough good to see you, but it's time to go. Don't say yes, but please don't say no. I don't want to be lonely tonight. Go away then, damn ya. Go on and do as you please, yeah. You ain't gonna see me getting down on my knees. I'm undecided and your heart's been divided. You've been turning my world upside down. Do me wrong, do me right now, baby. Go on and tell me lies, but hold me tight. Save your goodbyes for the morning light, but don't let me be lonely tonight. I don't want to be lonely tonight, no. don't want to be lonely tonight. Moving in silent desperation, keeping an eye on the Holy Land, a hypothetical destination. Say, who is this walking man? Well, the leaves have come to turn in, and the goose has gone to fly, and bridges are for burning, so don't you let that yearning pass you by. Walking man, the walking man walks, well, any other man stops and talks, but the walking man walks. Well, the frost is on the pumpkin, and the hay is in the barn, yeah. And Pappy's come to rambling on, stumbling around, drunk down on the farm. And the walking man walks, he doesn't know nothing at all. Any other man stops and talks, but the walking man walks on by, walk on by. And most everybody got seed to sow. It ain't always easy for a weed to grow. No, no, so he don't hold the rope for no one. The sure one's always missing, and something is never quite right. Ah, but who would want to listen to you kissing his existence goodnight? Walking man, walk on by my door. Well, any other man stops and talks, but not the walking man. He's the walking man, born to walk, walk on walking man. Well, now, would he have wings to fly? Yeah. Whoa. understand my ups and downs. There you were, with sweet love and devotion, deeply touching my emotion. I want to stop and thank you, baby. I want to stop and thank you, baby. Yes, I do. How sweet it is to be loved by you. Feels so fine. How sweet it is to be loved by you. I close my eyes at night, wondering where would I be without you in my life. Everything I did was just a bore. Everywhere I went, it seems I'd been there before. But you're bright enough for me all of my days, with a love so sweet and so. I wanna stop and thank you, baby. Oh yes, how sweet it is to be loved by you.
Good evening. It's nice to see you on this, what is for Montanans a warm evening. And this evening's LCLI, Local Church Learning Initiative, is on the theme of leadership. And I will be presenting on how to help those you care about thrive within the context of the four primary arenas of any organization. And following me will be Mike Gamble. Mike Gamble is a consultant with Oxano, a well-known church consulting company in the United States. He's a leadership professor here at YTI and in a graduate program, doctorate program with Jesus, with Wesley House in Cambridge, England, whose address has been Jesus Lane. So, all right, we're going to begin. The expansive view of humankind. Henry Ford said, "When all I need is a pair of hands, I have to hire the whole person." That is not a biblical picture of how God sees humanity, nor presents to us his creation. God presents an alternate view of humans as more than simply instruments or tools. We see a person as unique, God-breathed, aspirational, with an ability to expand capacity spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and purposefully. So we read in Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Or in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, for we are God's handiwork, or workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. There's a little cafe in Belgrade, Montana called the Cafe Havana, which specializes mostly in breakfast and light lunches. I used to have an office up there, and I would stop in there for coffee. And it had its usual regular coffee drinkers that would show up in the morning. And I bumped into a guy who was there more than once, and finally I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I build guitars." I said, "Really? Where do you do that?" "Well, I have a little shop out by the airport." I says, "Like, when you say build guitars, what do you mean?" "Well," he says, "I get orders and then I custom design guitars." I said, who buys them?" "Well, I don't know." He said, "The last person was Eric Clapton." So, I mean, there's one of the great guitar players in the history of rock, and there's a guy just sitting at the coffee shop, and yet he has an understanding of workmanship. And the Lord says, "You are my workmanship." 2 Timothy chapter 3, humankind is equipped for every good work. And then we are told, if it all kind of goes bad, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:17, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old is gone and the new is here. And in the book of Proverbs we read, chapter 22, verse 29, he that is diligent in business, we could use the word excellence if we wanted. He that is diligent in his business shall stand before kings. So the Bible's picture of mankind is expansive and opportunistic. Now there are phrases at the moment that are popular. One is human flourishing. But what's going on if a human is flourishing? In the study of empowerment, a person is flourishing if there are four activities that they are experiencing. And we're going to take just a moment to look at what they are. Number one is a person is flourishing when they have opportunities to make choices that matter in their sphere. There is a connection between our ability to choose and how we see ourselves as human beings created in the image of God. In the Garden of Eden, Adam, in one of his very first discussions with God, is told to name the animals. As far as we can tell from the passage of Scripture, there's no indication that God had set up a review board to check out if they really liked to go with giraffe and zebra. Somehow God felt that Adam had the capacity to name the animals. When Jesus was going through a town, a blind man called out. People thought he was being a bother, and they pushed him into the background. Jesus, seeing what was happening, turned around and said, "No, bring him to me." They brought Bartimaeus to him, and then Jesus asked this unbelievable question. He said, "Bartimaeus, what do you want?" And he was inviting Bartimaeus to make a choice about what he was going to talk to the creator of the universe about. Mordecai offered Esther a choice between being an advocate for her people or avoiding conflict. And Jesus communicates choice when he says in John 10, "No one takes my life, I lay my life down." A large mall had new owners. They hired a new manager. The manager sat down one day with the maintenance team and began to ask them questions about how they worked. At one point he said, "Now we have a lot of rug shampooers that we use. How is the shampoo purchased?" Well, they said somebody in the office has always purchased it. The new owner's manager said, "But you're working with the machines all the time. Don't you know better than anybody what shampoos are better for these machines? Which ones gum up quicker?" Well, they said, "We do, but nobody ever asks us." So he says, "Well, within our budget constraints, I want you now to begin to choose the shampoo." How minute that is. But in the study of empowerment, there is no more toxic quality than being micromanaged. To be micromanaged leaves people with a feeling of being diminished. And so when we're thriving, when we are flourishing, there is a sphere of choices that we're making. And you and I know if we're parenting well, we're actually helping our children make more and more complex choices as they go along. A answer to a 4-year-old, because I told you so, isn't a very good answer for a 17-year-old because something else is going on. And so opportunities that help, that make choices that matter. The second is competencies that are given expression and capacities that are given space to increase. There is within us a desire to do things well. God, at the end of the 6th day, said he looked at everything he had made and he says, "This is very good." And created in his image, we want to be able to look at some things we're doing and say, "This is very good." We want competencies. 2 Timothy 2, "A workman that needeth not to be ashamed." The Bible talks about, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in the little things. Now I'll make you ruler over much." I work with an organization in Southeast Asia that gives microloans to women. It's a funny thing. They don't give microloans to men. They give microloans to women. Somebody asked them why. He says, because the women are better at paying them back. And in one of the major cities of Asia, they were giving $100 loans to women. And all through that city, there's these little kiosks that sell product. And this woman took her $100 loan that she had gotten, and she rented one of these little kiosks, and she started selling coffee. Now, she was doing well, and so she paid back her loan, and now she got a second loan, and she added bread to her coffee. And now she was selling bread and coffee. And she paid back that loan. Now, with no debt, she actually started to be able to save money. And when she finally had saved enough money with her little kiosk, from out of which she had borrowed only $200, when she had finally saved enough money, she made the first major purchase in her life. She bought a bed so her children would never again have to sleep on the floor. That's what competency is. You feel the dignity of that. And we all want to be good at something. The third is actions that have meaning. Now, meaning's intrinsic. Eric Liddell, in Chariots of Fire, who eventually went on to become a missionary, was being challenged by his girlfriend that he shouldn't be so wrapped up in running, for which he ended up going to the Olympics and winning a medal, because she thought it was going to pull him away from his first love, the Lord. And he said, yes, but when I run, I feel his pleasure. We are designed to function with meaning in our life. And we almost have a corner on it, because the Christian environment talks about calling. And calling is very akin to living with a sense of meaning. I was watching a travel show on television, and they were interviewing people who worked on a Viking cruise ship. Now, the Viking cruise line is mostly famous for river cruises throughout Europe and other parts of the world. But they do have smaller cruise ships, not these 6,000 people, but cruise ships with like 900 on them. And in one part of the show, they're interviewing the captain. And the captain is saying, well, I've been a captain for many, many years. I've been a captain of freighters and oil tankers. But he said, I was meant to be a captain of a cruise line. Now, that was the phrasing he used. Now, in a separate interview, they're talking to the chef, and he's talked about all the places he's cooked. And then he says, but you know, I was meant to be a chef on a cruise line. Now, I was captured by the idea that they used the very same words to talk about there's something that linked what they were doing and who they were as human beings. That is a sense of meaning. And so when we run into Paul, his salutations are not just perfunctory. Romans, I'm called to be an apostle. Corinthians, called to be an apostle. 2 Corinthians, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ. Galatians, I'm an apostle sent not from men but by God, or sent not from men or by man. Ephesians, I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. It goes on and on and on. He knew what he was created to be and what matched the design of his life. So those are three: choice, competency, meaning. The fourth is the significance. We want to know that something we do matters to somebody. And there's two kinds of significance. Both apply. One is I'm doing something that has a positive impact. And the other is all of us play to some audience. I knew a man who was one of the hardest working men I ever knew. But driving with him one day, he said, my father told me I'd never amount to anything. And I knew one of his audiences, though his father had been long dead, he was still playing to that audience and that voice. So we have choice and competencies. We have meaning and significance. But in what setting do these play out? And I'm going to suggest to you that there are, in almost any enterprise, there are four aspects to that enterprise. Now, we might say these sound very secular. And most enterprises will have a leader or leaders who work with people, applying a strategy that serves a particular outcome. So those are four. Or we have a manager who has a team that takes them through a process to create a product. Or there's an executive director who leads a group using a system to achieve a vision. None of those sound very biblical until you think of Matthew chapter 4, verse 19, where we read, Jesus said, here we have our leader, follow me. Now he's building his team, and I will make you there's the process. For we know he spent over 2.5 years with that group, developing them so they could live out the call we read about in Acts to go into all the world. I will make you fishers of men, a simple, precise goal. So all 4 of those features are in that simple verse. So if we looked at those 4, say in each one of those arenas, we want there to be elements that allow a person to thrive. They're making choices, they're developing competencies, they're functioning with meaning, and they have a sense of impact. Let's look at leader. Mike Krzyzewski, once the basketball coach at Duke, says that leadership seems to be a pervasively significant part of the success of any enterprise. But I've been working with leaders for 50 years now. And as simplistic as this sounds, I find that most leaders who fail either fail for one of three reasons, excuse me. Either they behave in a way that creates shipwreck in their life, or they can't get along with people, or they don't get things done. Now, the funny part to me is that often the people who get along with people don't get things done. And the people who get things done tend to irritate and frustrate people. And I usually agree with the idea that you build on your strengths and you buttress your weaknesses, except these 2 pillars are so important. I don't think you can just say, well, I'm a get-her-done kind of person. I think somewhere along the line, you've got to get along with people if you're going to get it done, and vice versa. So let's think about Paul. He was a get-things-done kind of person. He was an all-in temperament. He was that way when he was breathing out threats against the church. And once he became a believer in Jesus, we find he was all in that arena as well. But he didn't get accepted into the church until Barnabas took him by the hand, led him into the fellowship, and said to the group, you can trust this guy. I vouch for him. Paul didn't have credibility, Barnabas did. And there are times in our life where we borrow credibility until we earn it ourselves. Now, Barnabas was that kind of guy. And so Paul and Barnabas get ready to go on a missionary journey, and Barnabas says, let's take John Mark. John Mark was a young believer. He was a relative of Barnabas's. And so away they go. They get into Pamphylia, kind of a mosquito-infested area. We have other accounts of people in that area who would go to higher country, higher ground in order to get out of it, to get well from getting sick. So Barnabas isn't having a good time. And he goes home. Well, next time they get ready to take a missionary trip, Barnabas says, let's try John Mark again. And Paul said, over my dead body. Because he was a get-her-done kind of person, and he wasn't going to take a step and then drag John Mark, take another step and drag John Mark. He wanted somebody who was with him and was an asset. Let's pick up the story a little later. Now Paul is traveling with Silas, and he goes to Lystra, where he is introduced to a young believer named Timothy, whose mother is a believer, and Timothy begins to travel with Paul, except Timothy is nothing like Paul. It appears that he was reserved and shy. We read that Paul urging him to stir up the gift that's within you. Later, he admonishes him, the Lord has not given you a spirit of fear or timidity. Paul sends him to a cantankerous Corinthian church with a letter, but he urges the Corinthians, now treat Timothy well and show him respect like you would if it were me. And when he's done, send him on his way in peace. I mean, he's really working to take care of Timothy. Perhaps Timothy struggled because the next time he sent somebody to Corinth, he sent Titus, who was a little more bracing in his temperament. But we hear Paul's protective spirit over Timothy. By the time Paul writes the Philippians from prison, he said, I'm sending you Timothy because I have no one like him. And when he nears his life, 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last things he wrote that we have in the New Testament, twice he says to Timothy, come quickly, come before winter. And he's developed now a deep, tender disposition towards Timothy in spite of Timothy's weaknesses. This brash Paul that dealt with John Mark seems to have shifted entirely. And in that little passage in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he even asked for John Mark to come and be a help to him. So we have a leader, we have a team. The end of Paul's life, 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last 8 verses. If those were the last things you were going to write, what would you say? But what does Paul say? In 8 verses, he talks about 20 different people. A team. Then there's the process. I was talking to a church leader. He had gone to a man very successful in business. He is a man who he and his brother developed welders who they have welders all over the United States now. They had a little welding company. They wanted to expand it from Montana. They started going to oil companies and saying, we're welders. If you have a job, it doesn't matter how big or small it is. It doesn't matter what time of the day or night it is. We'll be there and we'll do the job. They tested them out. It turned out to be true. Now they have people all over the country. When asked, just last week, how did you expand like that? This man said, well, it's kind of embarrassing because it's not the kind of person I am. I'm a get-her-done kind of person. But we had to build an infrastructure. We had to build systems, or we would have topped out. We would have never had the size of operation we have. So you have a leader, and you have a team. You also have a process, and then you have a goal. It's no accident in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15, that we're told exactly that it took Nehemiah 52 days to build the wall. Now, the goal has two qualities to it. One, it should be a virtuous, noble goal. Like if my goal is to be the best mob boss in the history of the mafia, I ought not really to expect God's blessing on that. But if it's a virtuous goal, that's one thing. There's another element. When part of my personal story gets woven into that goal, something almost magical happens. And so we'll finish with this. We like the Olympics. We're watching the Paris Olympics, Marcy and I. And every Olympics, as you know, something magical happens somewhere along the line. There's some storyline that captures you. I'm watching the 800-meter freestyle women's race in swimming. Now, that's a tough race because you have to have both speed and endurance. It's 16 lengths to the pool. And in this race, the favorites were Katie Ledecky, the great United States swimmer, and Ariana Titmus, who was the juggernaut from Australia. And the announcers are talking about these two great racers, and it's assumed they'll come in 1 and 2. Then, because they almost have to, they mention the other American racer in the finals. And there's Paige Madden in lane 6. Well, when the race is done, sure enough, Katie Ledecky wins first, Ariana Titmus wins second, but out of nowhere, Paige Madden wins the bronze medal and is not far behind these two world-famous racers. Now they're interviewing Ledecky and Madden at poolside. And Ledecky's talking, and Madden is standing there, and she's just weeping. She can't talk. I don't mean she's got a tear rolling down. She's convulsively weeping. And finally she blurts out, I didn't know I had this race in me. And I thought, well, I wonder what her story is. So I started digging around a little bit. Paige Madden comes from Mobile, Alabama. She had started racing when she was swimming when she was young, and she'd had some success. In the Tokyo Olympics, she had won a silver. And but by the Worlds, 2 years later, she didn't even qualify to go to the Worlds, and she was going to quit. People would have understood if she quit, because she had been suffering all of her life from Hashimoto's disease. Now, Hashimoto's disease is usually a disease that women get, but it's usually older women. But Paige Madden had had Hashimoto's disease since she was 13. And two of the symptoms of Hashimoto's disease is muscle weakness and fatigue. Do you imagine all your life trying to be an Olympic level swimmer, and you're struggling with a disease that brings on muscle weakness and fatigue? And she just decided, I didn't even qualify to go to the Worlds, I'm going to quit. But her family said to her, Paige, try one more time. And she got by herself and began to think through what to do, and she finally decided, all right, and these are her words. If by my swimming, some little girl or a 10-year-old boy facing an uphill battle of something in their life are encouraged not to give up, it'd be worth it. And so she decided. Now you already see what's happening, don't you? She has a virtuous goal. She wants to swim. She wants to do well. She wants to win a medal. That's virtuous. But that now intersects with part of her personal journey. If I could encourage a young boy or a young girl not to give up. So she goes to the United States qualifying meet. The fastest she had ever swam the 800 meter was 8 minutes and 27 seconds. And at that meet, she swims the 800 meter in 8 minutes, 20 seconds, 7 full seconds off of her best time ever. Now keep in mind, this is a sport that measures performance by 1/100th of a second. And she's carved 7 seconds off. She qualifies for the Olympics. In the qualifying heat at the Olympics, she swims it in 8 minutes, 18 seconds, 2 more full seconds off of her best. And in that final, she swims that race 5 more seconds better than any race she has ever swum. In just weeks, she had taken off 14 seconds from her best ever. And when she stood at the edge of that pool and said, I didn't know I had this race even in me, she had done something that's almost unheard of in the sport of swimming, carving 14 seconds off in a matter of weeks. And the only thing that had changed was that her personal journey had intersected her virtuous goal and created a new dynamic in her performance. So the kind of goal you set and how it intersects the meaning and significance of your life really matters. So those are just some leadership insights in how we help those we care about thrive, and how we thrive in the 4 primary arenas of any enterprise. All right? Mike Gamble is up next. And he is going to tell you his topic, but it will be under the theme of leadership.
Thank you, Derry. It is quite hard to follow Derry with my presentation. It's a bit different in nature. Derry gets to bring you years of wisdom after finishing his PhD a decade ago. I'm on the far opposite end of that journey. Just my first year in, and so when they asked me to share some of the insights that I've gained so far in my first year of doing this, I invite you into my topic by taking a moment of reflection. I would like you to think about someone in your life who's influenced you in a way that if they asked you to do something, you would just eagerly do it. So just think of that person. And now think of the kind of person they are. And I invite you now to think of the opposite. Someone you know in your life who perhaps you might resist anything they asked you to do because of the kind of person that they are or how you experienced them, and just the kind of things that they do that cause you resistance. Now, I don't want to trigger or traumatize anyone, but I just invite you to just compare and contrast those two people, and I invite you into what is the heart of my PhD topic, which is researching the virtue of leaders and its effectiveness in organizations. As in ministry, we expect a certain kind of behavior from clergy, from pastors, from church leaders. And sometimes we don't always see that. Sometimes it's curious that it seems like church leaders do this on purpose because they think it's effective. And that gets to the heart of some of my original curiosity is why do we sometimes see bad behavior by clergy, and why do they seem to think it works? The boss that walks into the room and barks at the people and walks out all proud and peacocked because they're willing to be a jerk, because that's effective leadership. We don't see this all the time with clergy. By no means would I say that, but we do at times see it. And so we just wonder, why do we see it and what's happening? So as I approach this topic, I want to first of all say that there are a variety of responses to the discussion of leadership behavior in the church. There are those who feel like this is a topic that is, as my children like to say, verboten. My children like to say this because they took German in high school and think it's fun to speak German. And it's just a fun word, right? It's forbidden. Like there is a sense in which we're not supposed to talk about this topic. And people feel uncomfortable if we talk about it at all. Then there's another end of the spectrum where we have our justice warriors who seem to get glee and enjoyment over any foible that a leader might have. And I just want to say the posture of this conversation is neither of those things. If anything, it's looking in the mirror at my own leadership and just saying, how can I do better? Recognizing times when I have made mistakes, thinking that I was being a good, courageous leader, doing the hard thing, and recognizing not only am I doing the wrong thing, it's not even working. And how do I think about that? And how can we think about this better? So that's kind of the topic and the tone of my presentation or my lecture tonight. And so I'd like to introduce you to 3 cases that you may have heard about. I'm a consultant. I work with churches all over the country, but I don't want to talk about my clients because all of my clients are awesome and they would never do any of the things that we're talking about now. Instead, we're going to talk about 3 very public failures, and it's going to be very brief. We're not going to spend a long time on it. But these are all within the last 5 years or 6 years. If you pay attention to church news, these are things that you heard about. If you didn't, good for you. In 2018, news and a bunch of hubbub came around about the early resignation of one of the preeminent pastors in North America at Willow Creek Church. He founded and grew a church to over 20,000 in regular weekend worship attendance. Since 2010, there have been allegations of sexual impropriety, which were ignored by the board. Finally, in 2018, the congregation just kind of threw a fit. and they finally asked him to resign 6 months early, and he did so to not be a distraction, though they never investigated. But the point is, they took action in order for the best interest of the church. In second example is in Christianity Today in 2021 released a podcast titled "Who Killed Mars Hill," chronicling the behaviors of founding pastor Mark Driscoll, and they chronicled the rise and fall of the church following his behaviors. He advocated for what I would call a bellicose approach towards leadership and even discipleship. Now, if that's a word that your children haven't taught you quite yet from their Latin, it just means that he thinks that Jesus was a fighter. In one interview, he said that I can't respect a savior I could beat up. So he's like an Irish, like punch him in the face. He's the kind of church you'd go to if you want your pastor to beat you up. And he believed that this kind of discipleship was necessary to grow his church and to grow it bigger and to grow it the largest church in North America. Ultimately, his board removed him for toxic leadership, and his church collapsed in 2 weeks. Literally from 20,000 to 0 in 2 weeks. Finally, in 2022, Guidepost investigated the Southern Baptist Church denomination for 2 decades of refusal or a decision to not look into allegations of sexual impropriety against pastors. There's a number of reasons listed why they did not do this, why they did not investigate, but the theme was it would have hurt the church if we'd have done any investigations. They asked families to drop it because it'd be better for the church to not talk about it. So in each one of these cases, we see a utilitarian casuistry. We see a justification to not pursue truth because it could have hurt the church, which I find curious because in each case it ultimately contributed significant damage to each church. Mars Hill collapsed in 2 weeks. Willow Creek is now a third of the size it was. There's no way to know the impact on the Southern Baptist Convention. That's too big and complicated, but they certainly did not enjoy the publicity. Now, before I go any farther, allow me a brief diversion. Here at YTI, one of our emphases, what's the plural of emphasis? One of our emphasis is adventure. I know, I don't know either. Is adventure. And so I am not the adventure, we do not have Vern with us, I am not the adventure professor here at YTI, but I do like adventures. And in 2018, I did an adventure race here in Bozeman that I can freely confess was the single most painful thing I've ever done in my entire life. About 3/4 of the way through, I began to experience muscle, leg cramping that continued for a few hours, including about 45 minutes after I crawled down the mountain and just laid there on the ground in the fetal position. Now, for many people in the room, this might be the kind of pain you've experienced in your life, not for me. And it caused a little reflection afterward. I thought that I went into that race well prepared. I thought that I had trained really hard. I trained as hard as I thought I could. Number one, I realized that I needed to train harder. But mostly, I needed to train smarter. When I actually looked in and talked to people who did these things, I found out that I was pretty much doing everything wrong. I was spending my time in the wrong way, doing the wrong things. Many of the things I were doing was counterproductive, and I approached the race day all wrong. I was not ready. I did not know it. I thought I was. I learned in that moment to rethink all of my assumptions. And so, to extend this metaphor to these cases, Mars Hill, Willow Creek, the Southern Baptist Convention, I submit to you that in all of these cases, to their own degree, these men thought they were doing the right thing. I don't think that they stood before God and saying, I'm trying to hurt the church. I think they were trying to do the right thing. They were all very hard workers. Cannot deny that. And they were probably all following their convictions. And yet I suggest, just as with my race, I think that we can do better. And I think that we can learn from their mistakes without being angry or judgy or justice warriors. I simply think we can do better. And so my proposal is that, well, the question is, what are they missing? What are they doing wrong? And my proposal, my hypothesis is what we're missing is organizational virtue. So this is a word that Derry used several times in his, he talked about virtue, talked about flourishing. It is a word in my research that I've encountered, but as an organizational leader and consultant, we don't really talk about virtues. We talk about values. We talk about what are the values that guide your organization, what are the values, how do they guide your ethic and how you behave. We don't really talk about virtues so much, and yet I propose today and tonight that this is what we're missing. So to introduce virtues, I need to talk about virtue ethics. I'll do it as quickly as I can. It's not everyone's favorite topic, but you'll see the correlation pretty quickly, I believe. Virtue ethics, prior to the Enlightenment, was the reigning moral philosophy pretty much worldwide. And then the Enlightenment back in the 1500s, they got this amazing idea that they could develop a moral philosophy that was universal, that applied to anyone, everyone, and got rid of that pesky thing called emotion. We can just think our way into always knowing what the right thing to do is. So if you've heard of Immanuel Kant, he came up with this idea of duty, and then Jeremy Bentham followed, and he came up with what we call utilitarianism, which he said the ultimate good is the end, the best outcome for the most number of people. Well, just fast forward through 2 centuries from Jeremy Bentham, philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe declares that project has failed into incoherence. It did not work. No one could agree what the universal rules were, and the idea that you could just rationally always know what the right thing is had just failed into a puddle. Following Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, who you may know her from the famous Trolley moral dilemma, she advocated that we return to the ethic of virtues. That's just the agent. Like, are you a good person? Let's just go back to that. Maybe we don't always know the right thing to do, but maybe if we're good people, maybe we can figure out what to do by being good people. And then Alistair MacIntyre, the Scottish moral philosopher, picks up this mantle, and he goes back to Aristotle, who kind of started the conversation 2,500 years ago, and says, we need to pick that up, but bring it into the 21st century. He adds Thomas Aquinas to the mix, so if you like Thomas Aquinas, you're probably familiar with this conversation. MacIntyre even converts to Thomistic Catholicism from agnosticism, and he advocates for a distinctively Christian approach to virtue ethics. And so I'm locating my research, the moral philosophy of the work of Alistair MacIntyre. He provides a conceptual framework in which we can research and think about this problem of suboptimal moral behavior in leadership in the church. Second, this academic discourse around organizational ethics has extended into a call for organizational virtue, which I'll talk about in a few moments. And then finally, researchers have begun to discuss a way to empirically study virtue. So to define virtue, a virtue is a state of being, a human character that is a durable experience of thought, feeling, and action. So the easiest example of a virtue would be generosity. The generous person who gives the right thing at the right time, the right amount, and feels the right thing while they're doing it. It's a pretty high bar, which is kind of the point of virtue, is it's casting a high bar. The point isn't that we're perfect. The point is that we have something to look at and to aim for and recognize that we can do better. MacIntyre makes 4 assertions in his arguments that predict the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing in these church leaders that we talked about earlier. And I believe that that's what caught my attention. First, he applies this virtue ethic idea that disordered desire corrodes moral logic. If I want the wrong thing, changes my thinking and it makes me want and pursue that thing in a way that's not healthy for me or the organization. And he argues that organizations need profit, wealth, status, power, but that very profit, wealth, status, power that they need to survive corrupts their practice and the good that they have for the community. So it's this double bind. I need it, but if I get too much of it, it's bad for me. The example we might think of is we all need food for our family, but with it comes the temptation for gluttony. It's just always there. And applied to the church growth, which is needed, we need people. We can't have a church without people. Can't have a church without a building. We need revenue to do that. But it also brings with it a temptation and a corrosion of what God's ultimately called us to do. And McIntyre argues that the leader's responsibility is to attend to that tension. That's part of the leader's job, is to attend to the tension of we need it, but we have to watch out for it, all at the same time. He also argues that the virtues are necessary for individuals to develop moral rationality and to protect against the corrosive forces of these external goods like wealth and power. Virtues like humility, faith, patience, compassion. And then finally, he argues that humans, you and I, we're dependent on one another, and we need one another. And we cannot do this without each other. And this applies to the church because many leaders in the church feel very alone. I remember one of the first bits of advice I got when I went into ministry. I was probably 19. I was told, don't make any friends because they'll betray you. Pastors can't have friends. It's one of the first things I was taught. And I think that was reinforced in most churches I went to. Can't have friends. Can't have friends. I believe this makes it hard for pastors to learn how to be virtuous. People who can challenge them on the little things before they become big things. Because one of the big ideas in virtue theory is that it is how we form our moral habits. These are formed habitually. And the good ones are hard, and the easy ones are easy. The bad ones are easy. That's how virtue and vice, its corollary, works. And so in my proposal, you remember I said, or a lack of organizational theory, a lack of organizational virtue. There are kind of three big ideas for a virtuous organization. First, they have and expect the people in them to be virtuous. There's just a call, like, hey, we do this around here. We expect humility, and we expect it just kind of from everybody. So we expect it from our leaders. We also expect it from the congregation. And we expect it to be a conversation. So in virtuous organizations, it's kind of we're all looking in the mirror and we're all helping each other do that because we all recognize that some of the virtues are actually really hard. It's really hard to be humble. And sometimes some of us need people to challenge us to go deeper. Second, virtuous organizations empower and free people to prioritize the virtues over efficiency. Most leaders are hired to achieve. It's the unspoken assumption, some churches have spoken, that the pastor's job is to grow the church. And as a consultant, I know that if the church is not growing, the pastor is hurting. Now, he might not say it, or she might not say it, but when they look in the mirror, they wonder, what's wrong with me? Because they were ultimately brought here to turn the thing around, to bring people in. The virtuous organization hires people to be. There may be an expectation to grow. They may need to grow to pay the salaries. That may be needed. But the virtuous organization empowers and frees people to prioritize the virtues over efficiency. And third, a virtuous organization facilitates voice throughout the organization regarding its goals. This one might be the most radical of the three. This particular one says to everyone, what are our goals? Why are we here? What human good are we contributing to our community and to one another? Let's all kind of always be talking about that. And the conversation goes both ways. Most churches struggle to set up for clergy to hear the people in the pews and vice versa. It's usually top down. And now, the reason why we do this, and it's a good reason, is because we don't want to get it wrong. And so the presumption is the clergy know what's right, and the presumption is the people in the pews don't. And surely that's sometimes correct, right? But if we think about, and I'm not saying who's the child in this analogy, but if we think about our children, and we think about two children, and there's one child who you say, you have to share your toys, you have no choice. And the other child who you say, we share our toys around here, I'd really like you to share your toys. Are you going to share your toys? Watch me model sharing our toys. And that child chooses to share their toys. Which one is going to develop moral agency? Which one is going to become the moral child? The one that has no choice or the one that has the freedom to not? This is the basic nuts and bolts of the theory, is that when leaders invite the whole congregation in to determine how we're going to sacrifice and give up our privileges and our rights for those who don't have them, when they're given the freedom and they make those choices, they begin to grow. They begin to grow in their faith. And I believe that some of the double bind that we have is that we've spent so long not allowing for there to be voice that the voice is atrophied. And so that when we do invite it, they give us what we think they're going to give us, which is just give us what we want. Because they've not even been given that voice for so long. And so it is not an easy thing. And I understand why we hesitate to do that. But the three things are, the three aspects or dynamics of a virtuous organization are they have virtuous agents, they empower virtuosity, and they free it. And then they facilitate voice throughout the organization to develop that virtuosity. And so if we go back to the beginning, I say, I made the claim that the church could benefit from more investment in organizational virtue. And when we think back on those three cases, I think that if there had been leaders in place that were expecting this, that were openly in dialogue with one another, and I think that we would have started to see a much quicker short-circuiting of maybe a journey down the vice trail, and we may have seen a much ameliorated the losses that we saw at some of those churches. And so with my research, I'm still in the research phase. I will spare you the details of how we are going to try to research virtue, but you can pray for me. I'm trying to figure that one out. The challenge is to discover how do people process how to be humble. What is the narrative? What's the humility narrative as I approach a challenging decision within church responsibility and organizational leadership? So my claim at the beginning, go back to the managing the tension between growth and mission, is that the purpose of the church ultimately is to help one another find peace with God in our community with that. And that as we do that, that brings growth, which brings a focus on the growth rather than what we're supposed to be doing. And the challenge, all of us, is to focus on the thing we're supposed to be doing. What's God ultimately called us to do, focus on that mission that he's given us. Attend to the need to growth and the need to create progress, but not let it take over. So that is my presentation for the evening. What questions? I noticed that Derry didn't allow questions, but I kind of like inner dialogue and questions, so I invite you to quest away.
What's your group of people that you're, for your paper, I'm assuming, this is part of your dissertation that you're proposing?
Mm-hmm.
What's your study group?
Yeah, my study group will be church teams, and I will probably develop multiple cases to study how they process the interaction of virtue and organizational leadership.
So you'll find them through people that you're consulting with already?
I have not gotten to the point where I am asking people to be subjects of my research, but I do have a book of clients that when I pitch it the right way, people are interested in talking about it. I would really like, yeah. It's the people who are trying who want to talk about it. And that's who I want to learn from. Like, how are they processing it? Where do they think it's hard? And the role of relationship. How do I find clergy, particularly who are in a relationship, like have friendships that can challenge them, inform them? Because that is very rare in the church. We don't invite challenge to clergy, particularly within a church context, from the congregation. So I don't know if I'll find that. I don't even know if that exists. But it's a great question that just keeps me up at night.
I'll pray that you find people.
I do have people. I've yeah. What else? What other questions do we have?
Could you speak on the challenges of making a subjective thing like virtue, putting numbers to it? I know they try to do that in social science a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Why would anybody really want to put numbers?
A whole section of my paper that I did not read tonight for time was based on all the other approaches I could have taken. And in 2000-ish, Marty Seligman, the father of positive social psychology, said, psychology's been too focused on the negative. We need to go positive. We need to discuss what the flourishing life looks like. And so he just took over the word virtue. And he advocated for a measurement of virtue and happiness. So you fill out questionnaires. How happy are you on a scale of 1 to 5? How often are you happy? How generous are you? How grateful are you? How amazing are you? How humble are you? And that's very popular in social psychology. And this has received many challenges. And the basic challenge is, well, when you say that you're generous as a 5, how do I know that's the same as you saying a 5? And the reality is, his 5 is probably my 2, and your 3 is your 1, and that's your 6. And so now, they know this, and the theory is if we take enough bad data and aggregate it, that we're going to get good data, and that will become like a trend. And so I mean, you're laughing at the right thing. It's kind of absurd, but that's how they measure it. So that there are whole big conversation about how to manage that. One interesting person to think about would be Adam Grant's book, Give and Take. He talks about reciprocity style. Are you a giver, or are you a taker, or are you a matcher in relationships? And he studies that and your organizational outcome, in particular your output within an organization. How good of an employee are you if you're a giver, matcher, or taker? And what he found was that people who were takers performed best at the beginning of their career and then began to tail off. The matchers were kind of in the middle all the way through, and then the givers had a very slow ramp. They underperformed at the beginning of their careers, but at the end of their careers, they were the top performers. But within it, the whole idea and the thing that he discovered was that it was really the people that balanced it, who lived in the middle. And they what they're beginning to find in social sciences is the people who say they're a 5 are not actually 5s. They're really more like 1 or 2, and they don't know that they're 1 or 2s. They're telling themselves they're 5s. It's the people who are 3 and 4 who are actually seeing the best results. So they call it the inverted U. It's the people down here that are actually the most virtuous. Now, how do you, yeah, so it's the approach. I will not be taking that approach. Alistair McIntyre is heavily critical of that, and I agree with his criticism, that it's just not good data. The only thing we can, I believe the only thing we can do is ask people stories, is tell me your narrative. If someone is, like, go back to generosity, if someone gives an extremely generous gift, but they do it for the wrong reason, that's not really the kind of generosity I'm measuring. That person is doing something different than being generous. I can't measure it just by how much they gave. And if they're not joyful, well, So you have to, it's messy now, it's messy and it's hard because we're collecting stories. So, great question. What other questions? All right. Thank you very much. Dr. Long, how do we close the evening? Excellent, we are closed.